An abandoned house, a hidden trap, and two friends risking it all to uncover the truth. But did they uncover something they should have never seen? Who was behind this terrifying game, and what were they planning next? Hello, my YouTube family. I'm Naira Vox, a 23-year-old college girl with a curious heart and a love for the unknown. And tonight, I bring you my 7th horror story on this channel. So for the best experience, put on your headphones, turn off the lights, and let your imagination drift into the darkness. If you enjoy the chills and the thrill, show some love in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more haunted tales daily. It all happened a few winters back. About 6 months had passed since I finalized my divorce, and honestly, my heart craved a fresh start. Christina, my girlfriend back then, came up with the sweetest idea. A getaway somewhere peaceful, far from all the madness I was drowning in. After some searching, we stumbled across a rental by a serene lake up in upstate New York. Without overthinking it, I booked it for an entire week. The place was everything I didn't even realize I needed. Modern enough to feel comfortable, yet cozy and tucked away by the water's edge, embraced by endless woods. There were only a few other homes dotted along the shore, most of them abandoned for the season. Honestly, I loved that. I just wanted to disappear from the noise of the world for a while. The host wasn't going to be around, but he had sent detailed notes on how to find the key. Basic instructions about the house, the usual Airbnb kind of thing. We pulled up that morning, and right there on the front steps, something unexpected was waiting for us. A small package, neatly placed, with no return address. There was only a handwritten note attached to it that read, "Enjoy your stay. Make sure to stay warm." Something about it was kind of charming, but a little odd too. Inside the package, tucked carefully, was a tiny box of matches. We laughed it off, figuring it was some quirky welcome gift. Odd but harmless. Christina even joked that folks in the countryside always had their little eccentricities. And that was that. The next 2 days were bliss. Long hikes through endless white snow, hot cocoa by the crackling fireplace, and the kind of silence that almost feels sacred. Oh, and I should mention, it had been snowing steadily since we arrived. Not a full-blown blizzard. There wasn't much wind or heavy fog, but just enough snow to blanket everything in a fresh, untouched kind of beauty. It felt absolutely perfect. I guess this would be a good moment to paint a little picture of the house for you. The master bedroom, where Christina and I stayed, was tucked away upstairs on the 2nd floor. It had these breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling windows right across from the bed, giving us an endless view of the shimmering lake outside. The roof, or maybe just the windows, must have been thinner than usual, because even from inside, we could hear the gentle tapping of snowflakes landing. It added such a peaceful, almost magical touch to the whole experience. There was also a skylight positioned perfectly above us. So at night, we could drift off to the sight of a snowy sky twinkling above. It felt dreamlike. But then, sometime after midnight on our 3rd night, I was pulled awake by a noise. At first, it barely registered, muffled under the whirling sounds of the wind and snow outside. What struck me first, honestly, was the storm itself. The snowfall had intensified while we were asleep, and now the world beyond our windows had transformed into a furious, white blizzard. Blinking the sleep from my eyes, I focused harder on the noise that had stirred me. It was different. It didn't belong to the wild, natural sounds of the forest or the lake. It was mechanical, man-made, almost out of place in this isolated winter wonderland. Carefully, trying not to wake Christina, I slid out of bed and tiptoed across the room. I pressed my face closer to the cold glass and peered outside. And that's when I saw it. A snowmobile. It was crawling slowly across the frozen lake. Now, I know snowmobiles on ice aren't exactly rare. People do it all the time in places like this. But at that hour, in the middle of a heavy snowstorm, it just didn't make sense. The snow was falling so thick now that it blurred the landscape, but I could still make out the figure. The driver was inching forward cautiously, like even they weren't fully sure if the ice beneath them would hold. And then they just stopped. Completely. I stared as the figure climbed off the snowmobile and began frantically waving their arms, like they were in some kind of trouble. It looked like they were yelling, but with the storm howling around us, I couldn't make out a single word. And then my heart dropped. I realized they were facing directly toward our house. Could they somehow know we were there? It didn't seem possible, but whether they knew or not, it was obvious they needed help. I quickly woke Christina, whispering urgently about what I had seen. Then, throwing on as many warm layers as I could, I hurried downstairs and stepped out onto the deck. The cold hit me like a wall. Even through all my clothing, the icy air clawed at my skin. But that wasn't the biggest shock. Through the swirling snow, I could hear her voice now. The person stranded on the ice. And it was a woman. She was screaming for help, crying out, "Thank God, someone's there," over and over. Her words broken and panicked. She kept sobbing that she had lost her little boy somewhere in the storm. There was no hesitation. If there was a child out there in this brutal weather, alone and scared, he wouldn't survive long. I laced on my boots as fast as I could and told Christina to stay safely inside. Then, I pushed forward toward the frozen lake. As I got closer, her features became clearer. She was bundled in a heavy fur coat, her hair tightly braided, her whole body trembling from cold or maybe fear. The ice beneath me felt solid, firm and unyielding, which brought a small sense of relief. At least I knew the boy hadn't fallen through. But as I moved closer, her story shifted. Through broken sobs, she said her son had run away from home, and she had been out searching for him. Something about that made me hesitate. I had expected her to say the boy had fallen off the snowmobile during the ride, that maybe she hadn't noticed right away in the storm. But now, doubts started creeping into my mind. How could anyone not realize their own child had fallen off a moving snowmobile? The adrenaline had clouded my instincts earlier, but standing there in the whipping snow, things were starting to feel off. Very off. I opened my mouth to ask her more. Where had she last seen her son? What was he wearing? But before I could say anything, she asked something that made every hair on my body stand on end. "Do you still have those matches?" Her voice shifted, playful almost, and for a brief moment, I could swear she was smiling. Matches? It didn't click immediately. And then, like a punch to the chest, everything came rushing back. The package. The note. It hadn't been from the host after all. It had been from her. Before I could react, she reached into her thick coat and pulled out a gun, aiming it right at me. Her voice was sharp now, all pretense gone. She demanded my wallet and phone. I didn't even think about resisting. I handed them over with shaking hands. The entire encounter was over in seconds, a blur of shock and fear. Without another word, she swung herself back onto the snowmobile and disappeared into the storm, her figure swallowed up by the endless white. The second she was out of sight, I turned and sprinted back toward the house, slipping and sliding across the ice, screaming for Christina to call the police. By the time I stumbled back inside, Christina was already on the phone with them, her face pale, her hands trembling. I locked every door and window in the house, pacing back and forth, unable to calm down. I kept glancing outside, half expecting to see that snowmobile circling back for more. The police arrived about an hour later, but by then, the fresh snowfall had already erased any trace she might have left behind. Christina broke down, crying the moment the officers stepped through the door. I was too angry to cry. I had come here for peace, for healing. Instead, we got ambushed by a stranger with a gun. There was still some hope, though. I figured the police would find her snowmobile abandoned somewhere nearby. There weren't many places she could have come from. But once again, I was wrong. The officers found an old, half-frozen boat ramp on the far side of the lake. Their best guess was that she had used it to access the frozen water. And with the storm covering her tracks, they said there wasn't much they could do. Even if she dropped something, it would be buried deep under the new snow. With Christina's help, I tried tracking my phone, but it was already powered off or destroyed. The only silver lining in the whole nightmare was that the Airbnb host refunded our entire stay. He sounded genuinely horrified when I told him what had happened. He swore he hadn't sent any package. Still, something didn't sit right. How had she known we'd be there? And why go through so much trouble, so much planning, for something as small as a robbery? The questions haunted me long after we left that cabin behind. I couldn't shake the suspicion that the host had something to do with it. But without proof, what could I do? I brought it up with Airbnb, hoping they'd take it seriously. But they were about as helpful as a wet match in a rainstorm. Maybe I've always been a little paranoid. Maybe I see patterns where there are none. But even so, for a long time after the incident, I couldn't help but wonder if my ex-wife had something to do with it. Even typing that out makes my blood boil. I can practically picture her smug, stupid grin, laughing herself sick at my expense. I've since made my peace with how likely that possibility really is. But even now, nothing about it truly adds up. Why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths? Just for a wallet and a phone? Unless they were truly deeply disturbed, getting some sick thrill out of terrifying complete strangers. And just like that, life moved on. My family owns a lake house up in Northern California, a little two-story place with a creaky old attic. We only visit a few weeks out of the year, usually during peak summer when the lake sparkles like glass under the sun. When my younger sister and I were kids, we'd climb up into that attic with our sleeping bags and pretend we were on grand camping adventures. We even used to drag our little puppy up there, giggling the whole way. There's this tiny window tucked into the attic wall, just big enough for two kids to squeeze up against. We'd sit there for hours, peering down at the lake, watching the boats and swimmers like tiny ants below. We thought it was the greatest thing in the world back then, especially in those early teenage years, when everything still felt full of wonder. As we grew older, we just got too big for the attic, and the sleeping bag days had to come to an end. Looking back, it was a little sad, but you know what they say, everyone has to grow up eventually. When our grandparents passed away, my parents inherited most of their furniture. There was enough space for the bigger pieces, but the attic, it ended up crammed with smaller hand-me-downs. My parents never had the heart to part with any of it. It was all they had left of Nana and Pop, and even though it felt bittersweet, there was a kind of reassurance in knowing their most cherished things were still with us. It felt like they were watching over us in some way. Honestly, that whole time marked the end of my childhood, and I bet my sister would agree. As we got older, it became harder for my family to make it out to the lake house. My studies kept me busy, and my parents' work consumed most of their time. At best, we might all get a single week off for a family trip, but nothing beyond that. My parents never wanted to rent out the place when we weren't there, afraid the antiques might get damaged or stolen by shady tenants. So for most of the year, the house remained abandoned, only kept up by the landscapers we hired to maintain it. But a few years ago, everything changed. They met a local, elderly veteran who now worked as an antique restorationist. He was a small, disfigured man with white hair and one of those greasy, gruff beards. To be honest, he looked a bit odd. His voice matched his appearance, low, gravelly, and off-putting. Still, my dad bonded with him over their shared military background. He told us, reassuringly, that none of us could truly understand what it was like to lay your life down for your country. And in his eyes, men like him deserved a good deal on a place to stay. We didn't really get a say in what my dad decided to do, but the lease was signed. I can tell you firsthand, this elderly man seriously creeps me out. It wasn't just the way he looked either. We were all a bit upset that my dad signed the lease with him, mainly because it meant we wouldn't be able to visit the lake house during summer. But my parents could use the extra cash while putting us through college. So my sister and I eventually got over it. Even though they trusted him to keep the place in good condition, they still checked in on him from time to time. A little nudge here and there from the landscapers, just to make sure everything was all right. And of course, to ensure he hadn't fallen or had any other issues that went unnoticed. These indirect check-ins seemed like the perfect solution. We stayed out of his way, but still had some peace of mind. You could call it invasive, I guess, but the way we saw it, this guy was getting a great deal on the place. What's a few questions from laid-back landscapers every now and then? It wasn't like he was physically going to maintain the lake house by himself. My dad reasoned that the rent covered all the upkeep, and for a while everything seemed fine, until the maintenance guys pointed something out to my mom. They told her about his strange, predatory behavior. While working on the neighbor's yard, they'd often spot him sitting on the porch, staring oddly at the children by the lake. They even said they'd caught him doing some other things that I'm not comfortable repeating. My mom, being the saint that she is, hated the idea of a disfigured old man leering at kids while living in her beloved lake house. She talked my dad's ear off about it until he couldn't take it any longer. I still remember my mom screaming at him, furious about how irresponsible it was for us to accommodate someone who could be a potential predator. My dad finally cracked when the year-long lease came to an end. He tried to let the man down easy, showing respect for his military background, but the lies slipped out. My dad told him they were planning on some housework that would leave him without electricity or plumbing for a few months. The guy left without too much fuss, surprisingly. It wasn't like the money my parents had made off him was all that great. They assumed he'd find another place without much trouble. My mom, however, wanted him out of there fast, so we paid the landscaping guys a little extra to help him pack his things. Admittedly, I was kind of glad to see him go. It always felt off, having someone so strange with unlimited access to our house. About a year later, my younger sister graduated college, and my parents jumped at the chance to take some time off. We flew out for a summer trip at the lake house, and they'd recently adopted a black lab mix named Bear, who my sister hadn't met yet, so she was especially excited. I'll skip the small talk, but when we finally arrived at the house, The sun was just starting to set. We decided to leave Bear inside while we went out for dinner in town. The house wasn't stocked with groceries, so we didn't have much choice. Before we left, though, I noticed Bear acting strange. His ears were perked up, and he kept pacing back and forth, almost like he was waiting for something. I figured he was just restless from the long trip, and I brushed it off. We weren't gone long, just enough to grab some food and let the heat die down a bit. But when we stepped back inside, something didn't feel right. Like, seriously off. Before I could say anything, the silence hit me. I saw Bear, sprawled out at the foot of the stairs, panting hard. My sister screamed, and it was then that I noticed the blood smeared on the floor beneath him. My mom quickly pulled out her phone, presumably to call 911. Without saying a word, my dad made his way into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and I followed suit. The two of us began to cautiously move through the house, searching for the intruder. By the time we made it to the top floor, my dad motioned for me to stop. It took me a second, but I eventually saw what he was looking at. The attic hatch was open. Not wide open, just cracked, but enough to see the faint glow of a flashlight shining down. I won't lie, I was paralyzed with fear. If it weren't for my dad, I don't know how I would have reacted. Without hesitation, he yanked open the hatch and started climbing up the ladder. I didn't follow this time. I was too terrified. I stood there, waiting for some kind of fight to break out, but the only sound was the heavy silence of the house. Then, a few moments later, my dad descended back down the ladder, looking calm, too calm. He whispered that it was our old tenant. I could see the conflict in his eyes, like he didn't know what to do next. My mom ran up the stairs and started screaming when she found out what was happening. My dad, surprisingly, wanted to let the guy go, but my mom wasn't having any of it. She'd already called the police, and it was too late. When the police arrived, they went up to the attic and brought the guy down the ladder. He looked like he'd been through hell, and I could tell my dad felt nothing but sympathy. The police found our house key on him, which angered my mom even more. She was furious that my dad had promised he'd change the locks. Luckily, Bear survived, although he was seriously injured. It's awful to say, but despite what that man had done, my dad refused to press charges. No matter what my mom or sister said to try and convince him, he stood his ground. That argument was one of the biggest fights my parents ever had. I never understood why my dad had so much sympathy for someone who had stabbed his dog. All this took place about a year ago, and we haven't been back to the lake house since. I hate to admit it, but this whole experience has completely shattered my childhood image of that house. I can't say I'm eager to go back anytime soon. This happened last summer. I was 20 years old. My name's Kevin. My friend James comes from a ridiculously wealthy family. His dad's an IP lawyer who contracts with the US government or something along those lines. They've got properties all over the country and even a few international ones. That's the kind of wealth I'm talking about. One of their houses sits on a large but fairly secluded lake. The lake itself isn't so big that you couldn't see the houses across it, but swimming across would be a workout for sure. James's parents were rarely around, so he basically had unlimited access to the place. He'd invite friends over whenever, with their permission, of course. There's something about being out on the lake that makes you feel invincible. It's not the same as the beach. I'm not sure how to explain it, but it's got this exclusive vibe. Maybe one day I'll be successful enough to afford one of my own. Like I said, the lake's secluded. There are big, fancy houses lining its perimeter, but most of them stay dark and empty. They're vacation homes, barely used. It's kind of sad when you think about it, honestly. But there are some upsides, like the fact that James could throw some wild parties, since there was usually no one around to call the cops. But this night was different. It was just the two of us keeping it low-key. I won't get into it, but I'd just broken up with my girlfriend of 3 years. I was in desperate need of some bro time. We were out on the dock having a few beers when I noticed something weird. A light was flickering across the lake. At first, I thought it was just the sun reflecting off something into my eyes. But even when I turned my head to the side, I could still see it. It was flashing, like someone was turning a light on and off, repeatedly. James and I were glued to the sight, both of us trying to figure out what it could possibly be. It took us a while, but then it hit us. The flashing wasn't random at all. It was following a clear pattern, 3 short bursts, followed by 3 long ones, then 3 short again. I felt a bit dumb for not catching on sooner, but then James snapped his fingers and said, "That's Morse code." I looked at him, bewildered, asking when he had learned Morse code. He told me he didn't exactly know it, but he recognized the pattern 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. That meant SOS. I called it nonsense, but out of curiosity, I pulled out my phone and Googled it. To my surprise, he was right. Maybe I'm a bit behind on this kind of knowledge, but it was all new to me. The flashing kept going, sticking to the same pattern for another minute or so. Then it suddenly stopped. James and I just stood there, staring, unsure of what to think. Was it a joke? Or was someone really in trouble? James suggested calling the cops, but I reminded him that we had been drinking and we weren't exactly of legal age. I was already dealing with a DUI charge, so the last thing I needed was more trouble with the law. He wasn't too happy with that, and I could tell he was torn. We both tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was someone who had fallen and needed help, but that didn't make sense. They could have easily just called the police. After some deliberation, we realized the only reasonable explanation we could come up with was something more sinister, like a kidnapping. We had always been the adventurous, risk-taking type, so we decided to check it out ourselves. If it turned out to be serious, we would call the cops. So, we went back inside. James's brother had a bunch of switchblades lying around his room. He was a bit of a strange kid. We grabbed a couple for peace of mind. James was confident he could drive, and suggested we drive around the lake to the house. But I stopped him. I wasn't comfortable with that idea for obvious reasons. James, knowing about my situation, made a joke, and I just laughed it off. But honestly, if we weren't going to drive, we really only had one other option. So, we walked back to the yard, grabbed James's dad's kayak, and dragged it into the water. At first, we were laughing, enjoying the adventure, but the further we paddled out onto the lake, the quieter it got. I think we both realized how stupid of an idea it was, but neither of us wanted to be the one to ruin the fun. By then, the sun was almost fully set, and it was getting harder to see. It wasn't completely dark. There was still light coming from some of the lake houses, but it was getting unsettling as we neared the house. When the house came into view, it was big, just like the others, but it was obvious that it hadn't been maintained in a while. For one, the dock was half collapsed, literally, half of it was submerged in the water. The flashing light had also stopped, which made things feel even worse. We had planned on tying the kayak to the dock, but with the way it looked, that wasn't going to happen. Luckily, the yard wasn't too high above the water, so we beached the kayak on the rocks, making sure not to slip. The adrenaline was kicking in, and I could tell James was feeling the same. We both looked up at the house. The light had been coming from the second floor. At least that much was clear. By now, James was really freaking out and kept insisting that we leave and call the police. I told him that the only way to do that was to kayak all the way back to his house because there was no service on the lake, and we'd need Wi-Fi to even get in touch with anyone. I reminded James how many abandoned buildings we had explored before, and this didn't seem all that different. He wasn't too thrilled by my reasoning, but reluctantly agreed. Honestly, looking back, I know how reckless this was. Everyone I've talked to about it agrees, but the truth is, neither James nor I are known for making the best decisions. Instead of walking to the front door, which would have been a huge mistake, we quietly circled the house until we found an unlocked window. Without making a sound, we slipped inside. The house was strange, not just abandoned, but utterly empty. There was no furniture, no clutter, not even the usual remnants of people who had once lived there. The floors and walls were bare. We moved cautiously through the rooms, searching for the stairs. There wasn't a soul in sight, and every room was just as empty as the last. When we finally found the stairs, we carefully made our way up. I mentally noted the location of the window, knowing we would need a way out. We crept down one of the hallways, eventually reaching the room where the light had been coming from. I pressed my ear to the door and heard nothing. I glanced at James, who gave me a silent nod, and I slowly pushed the door open. The room was empty, except for one strange thing. By the window sat an old projector. As I tiptoed closer, it hit me. This was no coincidence. The projector was facing the window. My heart started racing. This wasn't just an abandoned house. It was a trap set up on purpose. James must have realized it too, because I heard him start sprinting back down the hallway, not even trying to be quiet. Without thinking, I followed him. As we rushed down the stairs, I heard a door, probably a closet, slam open from the room we'd just left, followed by rapid footsteps. We didn't waste any time. We bolted through the house, making our way back to the window we'd entered through. James was already outside when I climbed through, but as I was squeezing through, I could hear those footsteps gaining on me. Without looking back, I pushed myself through and ran to catch up with James, who was already at the edge of the lake, waiting for me. I heard James curse, and that's when I realized what had happened. The kayak was gone. I quickly turned around, and from the side of the house, I saw someone running toward us. I could barely process what I was seeing. He was fast, too fast. I couldn't get a clear look, but it was obvious he was big. Definitely an adult. I pulled out my switchblade, ready to defend myself. I expected James to do the same, but instead, he spun around and leapt straight into the lake, hoodie and sneakers still on. Without thinking, I followed him. The water was freezing, but I didn't care. I swam as hard as I could, fighting the burning sensation in my arms and legs. We swam toward the light from James' house, which felt miles away. The swim seemed endless, but fueled by pure adrenaline, we finally made it. By the time we hauled ourselves onto James' dock, I thought I had hypothermia. I don't think I've ever experienced cold like that before. We rushed inside, locked all the doors, and immediately called the police. It took almost an hour for them to arrive, which honestly felt ridiculous. When they did show up, they went straight across the lake to check things out. They spent some time over there, but when they returned, they confirmed exactly what I had expected. They said there was no one there. They confirmed that the house had been abandoned for years, with no signs of recent activity. No footprints, no equipment, no personal belongings, just an empty house. The officers were not happy with us. They gave us the whole, "Why didn't you call earlier?" speech. James's parents were even angrier when they found out. Let's just say I wasn't invited back to the lake house after that incident. James later told me his parents were threatening to sue the town for allowing something like that to happen and the police for not investigating properly. As for me, I still have no idea what actually happened that night. I don't know who was in that house, why they set up that trap, or what they intended to do if we hadn't escaped. To be honest, I don't think I want to know. Most of my friends think it was a trap, and that whoever had planned it got scared at the last moment. I really don't want to think about what could have happened if they had gone through with whatever they were planning.